welcome back to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Stanley, and today we're going to dive into the second episode of our series on Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Once again, before we get started, I want to say that if you like the podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, go to our website, wellreadchristian.com, and subscribe for our newsletter. Our blog is also there, and it would be nice if you enjoyed that also. In today's episode, we're going to focus on one character primarily and his development arc in War and Peace. In a lot of ways, Pierre Bezukhov was written by Tolstoy as a reflection of himself and his own journey. And I think Pierre's journey is an important story because if you're reading closely, Tolstoy brings you through this adventure for you, this search for meaning. You don't have to spend your lifetime figuring it out alone because Leo has walked this particular road before, and he's here to tell you what he found. And maybe you don't want to take his word for it. Maybe you don't believe him. Maybe he's wrong. But regardless of what your opinion is, this is an important step in intellectual and cultural progress. And you should be aware of what Tolstoy has to say about the meaning of life, because it's an influential work, as I have talked about extensively in the introduction, the last episode. So let's follow Pierre, and you can make up your own mind about his life. Pierre is introduced as a lovable but absent-minded and overweight man who is socially inept. He really does not find his way around upper society well, and he relies on his future father-in-law to navigate him. Early in the story, Pierre's distant father dies, which leaves him with a massive inheritance, leaving him one of the richest people in Petersburg. With the influence of his future father-in-law, Pierre is pressured into marrying a young and beautiful woman named Helen, even though she's shallow, and their relationship is even more shallow than she is as a person. But Pierre doesn't really know any better, and the next thing he knows, they're married. So there you have it. But despite having an enormous amount of money and a happy marriage to start and lots of free time, nationwide fame and admiration, friends, family, social events to attend, Pierre still finds himself unable to sit alone. He feels like he constantly has to distract himself. Pierre tries to find fulfillment in having a place in high society with balls and dinners and such, but having connections and being important ends up not making Pierre as happy as he thought he would be. Pierre doesn't really understand his feelings, and so he just tries to bury it. He drinks and reads to try to alleviate this sinking, crushing weight within him. Anything to not be alone with his thoughts, really. Alcohol and books are like the equivalent of the modern-day social media, YouTube, Netflix, that kind of thing. And not that drugs and alcohol are no longer used to numb yourself, but this is what Pierre uses first, and I think we all have our own methods of escapism that we could probably relate. But as if all of these feelings weren't enough, Pierre's wife begins to show her true colors. She flaunts herself and flirts with other men, barely pays any attention to Pierre. And once they arrive at parties or social events together, she kind of just leaves him. Doesn't want to spend any time with him at all, stays out way later than him, and basically she makes it clear that she wants nothing to do with him and really only married him for his money and social status. And so Pierre becomes trapped and is angry and distraught and alone, and the weight of keeping up these appearances and realizing that his marriage is even more of a lie than he thought is just all too much. And so in one hysterical fit, Pierre leaves the house to be away from his wife and travels to one of his estates in another city. On the way, though, he runs into a mason who invites him to convert to the masonry. And the Masons offer Pierre a right relationship with God, a sense of belonging and community, a mission to spread love and universal brotherhood. Masonry is like religion for the serious soul. It's not your average churchgoer's paradise. If there is to be fulfillment in religious practice, these Masons would have it. And so Pierre joins the Masonry. And here we have Pierre for a long period where he's happy and optimistic. After only a few short years, however, Pierre learns that he's disillusioned and kind of disappointed. His wealth and generosity and social position, as well as his legitimate dedication and hard work, has made him an influential member of the Masons, but this influence has only enabled him to see that the Masons are too just people. He sees the pettiness and the selfishness and the short-sightedness and hypocrisy of his fellow Masons and can barely stand it. He tries to move forward in doing actual good and finds himself ineffective, both at home and in the Masonry. He tries to put forward his liberal ideas on his farm so the peasants won't organize or govern themselves effectively. His staff goes behind his back and puts things back to where they were before he leaves. Here's an important quote on Pierre's Disillusionment. Quote, Pierre was not, as formerly, overcome by moments of despair, spleen, and loathing for life, but the same illness that formerly expressed itself in abrupt fits was now driven inside and never left him for a moment. What for? Why? What's going on in the world? He asked himself with perplexity several times a day, involuntarily beginning to ponder the meaning of life's phenomena, but knowing from experience that there were no answers to these questions. He hastily attempted to turn away from them, picked up a book, or hurried off to the club or to Apollyon Kikanolevich's to chat about the gossip of the town. The Spanish offer up prayers to God through the Catholic clergy in thanksgiving for having defeated the French on the 14th of June, and the French offer up prayers through the same Catholic clergy for having defeated the Spanish on the 14th of June. My brother Masons swear in blood that they are ready to sacrifice everything for their neighbor, but they won't pay a single ruble into the collection for the poor, and have Astria intrigue against the mana-seekers, and fuss over an authentic Scottish rug and about charters, the meaning of which is unknown even to those who wrote them, and which nobody needs. We all confess the Christian law of forgiveness of offenses and love of one's neighbor, but yesterday a dissenter was flogged to death, and a priest, a servant of that same law of love and forgiveness, gave him the cross to kiss before the execution. So Pierre reflected, and, accustomed as he was to it, this whole general universally acknowledged lie amazed him each time like something new. I understand this lie and confusion, he thought, but how can I tell them all that I understand it? I've tried, and I've always found that in the depths of their souls, they understand the same thing I do, but they simply try not to see it. Pierre begins descending into a new low and stops going to the masonry meetings after this realization. He neglects to meet with other people or give money, and he is truly beginning to feel hopeless. Russia is losing the battle, and battle after battle, actually, against Napoleon, and finally, Pierre finds himself in Moscow, as it is completely abandoned and evacuated in anticipation of Napoleon's final advance into the Russian capital. Pierre refuses to leave, though, and finds himself hiding in buildings from the French, who begin plundering and looting and occupying the city. While in hiding, Pierre recovers his sense of meaning in a dark place when he decides to assassinate Napoleon. Pierre is at his absolute lowest point. He has been cut off from normal human interaction. He is brooding in a basement for days on end, thinking of the evils in the world and his failed attempts at bringing good into it. All he can think about, and he has many dreams about it, in fact, is killing Napoleon. But instead, Pierre is captured by the French and ends up forming a positive relationship, perhaps even a friendship, with some of his captors. They all share the same campfire. They all tell similar stories. They all laugh at each other and share wine and beer. And this human interaction seems to extinguish any thoughts of violence for Pierre, and suddenly his resolve to kill anyone, let alone Napoleon, vanishes entirely. While a prisoner of war, however, Pierre meets a simple, hard-working peasant named Platon Karatev, who is sort of Tolstoy's idea of a person living the ideal, simple life. Platon carries one of Tolstoy's most enduring ideas on his shoulders that commentators often pick up on. He's this character who exhibits real, practical wisdom that actually impacts the way that he lives his life. Platon is not afraid of death, and he accepts everything that comes to him. He has many catchphrases and sayings that have been passed down from his parents and grandparents, and his village in general. One of Platon's words of wisdom to Pierre, which teaches him by example, is to live to find joy and meaning in sacrifice and even in pain, to enjoy the little things in life and to endure the hard things with dignity. Here we see Pierre at his happiest. Pierre has given up thinking about his wife, his friends, his social status, his wealth. He's renounced all of it. And now all that exists is surviving as a prisoner of the French and trying to alleviate whatever pain he can for himself and for others. Pierre adopts almost a Buddhist sense of renouncing his desires in order to live pain-free. It's easy to not worry about the stock market if you haven't invested in any stock. It's easy to not be worried about someone breaking into your house if you don't have anything valuable in it. For Pierre, letting go of everything means gaining freedom, and enduring the pain he cannot avoid means virtuous, dignified sacrifice which elevates himself in his own eyes. Sacrifice, however, and the alleviation of pain does not end up satisfying his desire for a fulfilled, meaningful life. But in one flash, Pierre realizes that he has been looking at the entire question of meaning completely wrong. Pierre realizes that if the universe does have an objective significance, then his own pursuit of subjective fulfillment is really the wrong approach. Conversely, if God does not exist, then nothing is meaningful and nothing really matters at all anyway. For Pierre, seeing God on the other end of life means that everything is, by definition, meaningful. This indomitable belief in God for Pierre means that the world is God's stage and he is a character in it, and that he gets to watch the play and admire the scenery. Pierre can completely let go of his ego, his frets about his reputation, his fear about politics and the world stage, his fear of death and of the French. Pierre can let it all go and finally live life and be happy. Allow me to read another quote, and this one is important, so listen closely. I'll try to read it well for you. Quote, "That which he had been tormented by before, which he had constantly sought, the purpose of life, now did not exist for him. It was not that this sought-for purpose of life happened not to exist for him only at the present moment, but he felt that it did not and could not exist at all. And this very absence of purpose gave him that full, joyful awareness of freedom, which at that time constituted his happiness. He could have no purpose, because he now had faith. Not faith in some rules or words or thoughts, but faith in a living, ever-sensed God. Before, he had sought for him in the purposes he set for himself. This seeking for a purpose had only been a seeking for God, and suddenly he had learned in his captivity, not through words, not through arguments, but through immediate sensation, what his nanny had told him long ago, that God is here, everywhere. In captivity, he had learned that God in Karataev was much greater, more infinite and unfathomable than in the architecton of the universe recognized by the Masons. He experienced the feeling of a man who has found what he was seeking under his own feet, while he had been straining his eyes looking far away from himself. All his life he had looked off somewhere, over the heads of the people around him, yet there was no need to strain his eyes, but only look right in front of him. Formerly, he had been unable to see this great, unfathomable, and infinite in anything. He had only sensed that it must be somewhere, and had sought for it. In all that was close and comprehensible, he had seen only the limited, the petty, the humdrum, the meaningless. He had armed himself with a mental spyglass and gazed into the distance, where the petty and humdrum, disappearing into the distant mist, had seemed to him great and infinite, only because it was not clearly visible. Thus he had looked at European life, politics, masonry, philosophy, philanthropy. But even then, in moments he regarded as his own weakness, his mind had penetrated this distance, and there too he had seen the petty, the humdrum, and the meaningless. Now he had learned to see the great, the eternal, and the infinite in everything, and therefore, in order to see it, to enjoy contemplating it, he had naturally abandoned the spyglass that he had been looking through until then over people's heads, and joyfully contemplated the ever-changing, ever-great, unfathomable, and infinite life around him. And the closer he looked, the calmer and happier he became. The terrible question of why, which formerly had destroyed all his mental constructions, did not exist for him now. Now, to this question, why, a simple answer was always ready in his soul. Because there is God, that God without whose will not a single hair falls from a man's head. It might be worth going back and listening to the quote again, because this really is the heart of the episode, and the heart of what Tolstoy wants to communicate about Pierre in general. What he's saying is that whenever Pierre would look at something from the distance, so he'd be just getting into philosophy, or he'd be just getting into the masonry, it would seem mysterious and interesting, and he wanted to get to the bottom of it, and maybe he could find fulfillment there. But once he actually got there, he found that it was vacuous and that it was kind of actually petty and meaningless. Like, as if you actually thought that if you could understand certain mysteries or how certain things work together, if you could be the smartest person in the room, that you'd actually be happy. Or like if you actually got that new job, that you'd actually be happy. Or that if you finally scored the girl and you were in a happy relationship, that would make all of your life happy? So Pierre ran around trying to find things that made him happy, but every time he found it, he realized that it didn't make him happy, that he was not actually fulfilled. And the one thing that actually fulfills him is when he realizes that if God exists, everything has a purpose. Everything is meaningful. It's been placed there. And suddenly, there's not this buzz to try to get to the next thing, but now he can rest. Once the focus is taken off of himself and running around trying to find the next thing that's going to fulfill him, and he pauses to see a sovereign, all-powerful God who's orchestrating the entire universe, he can say to himself, look, it's not about me. And as soon as he takes that step, he can see the great and unfathomable and infinite miracle that is within everything, in every leaf or movement of the finger. He can see the might and power and design of God behind it. And he can take comfort in his smallness and in his insignificance. In some sense, he doesn't matter. He doesn't have to figure it all out. And before, this is a terrible and crushing thing. But if God exists, then it's a magnificent and beautiful thing. And listen closely, because there's a very important distinction that comes into play. I'm using the words meaning in two different ways. In one sense, I'm talking about meaning in an objective way. And in another sense, I'm talking about meaning in a subjective way. So a subjective sense of meaning is like, man, I really want that trophy. I really want to break the record for most home runs in a single season. But an objective meaning is something that, for example, God could give the universe. Like if God creates the universe, then he creates it with a very specific goal in mind. Or say if you create a tool, you create that tool in order to fulfill a specific purpose. So you might create an aircraft in order to fly. You didn't create it to drive. You didn't create it to sleep in. You created it with one singular purpose, and perhaps it will fulfill many purposes. But the idea is that there's an objective purpose that goes into this tool. For some reason, there are very few contemporary atheists who are willing to grapple with this distinction between subjective and objective meaning. I was listening to the Thinking Atheist with Seth Andrews. It's another podcast, and he was talking about the meaning of life. And he said that it's an absurd question. It's not even worth asking. And he gave the example of his desire to continue drinking his cup of coffee because it was warm and pleasing, and that's meaning enough. There's the meaning of life for me at this moment. The meaning of life for me at this moment is sipping this coffee. And as soon as I set it down and start thinking about something else, then that'll be the meaning of life. And that's good enough for him. He doesn't think about it any more than that. And no one else should, he says. Susan Blackmore, another atheist, gave a similar answer when she was debating Jordan Peterson on a show called Unbelievable. Here's what she said, quote, "When horrible things happen to me, or if I read some terrible thing going on in the world, my response is, nothing matters, it's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is, get used to it. Get on with it, girl," end quote. She goes on to explain a conversation that she has with her students, saying, let's suppose you become nihilistic. What are you going to do? Okay, tomorrow morning when you wake up, say to yourself that nothing matters and everything is meaningless. Well, you'll say that, but then you'll think, I need to go to the loo. And then you'll think, I'm hungry, I better get something to eat. And then maybe you'll find yourself bored and you'll go to your university classes. End quote. And her point is, well, darn, now you're just living life like the rest of us, going from one thing to the next. In a debate with Frank Turek in 2008, Christopher Hitchens was asked, "If God does not exist, what is the purpose of life?" Hitchens said, quote, "I can only answer for myself what cheers me up. I guess mainly gloating over the misfortunes of other people, crowing over the miseries of others. It doesn't always work, but it never completely fails. And then there's irony, which is the gin in the Campari. Sex can have diminishing returns, but it is amazing. And that's pretty much it, and it's a clear run to the grave," end quote. Now, Hitchens leaves it up to the audience to determine how much of what he says is sarcasm and how much he's sincere about. But the notion that we must make up our own meaning is unmistakable in his answer. But when atheists answer questions about the meaning of life with something to the effect of, there is no meaning in life and we just have to create it as we go along, they betray a fundamental misunderstanding with the question at hand. The question is not, well, if there's no meaning in life, what am I supposed to do with myself? Because, of course, the answer is, well, you just do whatever you want. The question, really, is this. It's, why should I try to find something subjectively meaningful if everything is really meaningless? I mean, why should I deceive myself by creating this massive illusion just to get through my days, just to project a goal and try to fulfill it? I mean, under that definition, it's just as good to collect sand as it is to collect nickels as it is to collect skulls. It's all the same. Okay, so what if I become a surgeon and save somebody's life? They'll still die in a few petty decades. If all of life is just a matter of motion and atoms colliding into each other in a spectacular accident, then what difference does it make whether I die alone as an alcoholic at 23 or surrounded by family as a 93-year-old man? And don't tell me it's because one lifestyle is more fun or sustainable or somehow better, because when you're dead, you're not really going to care. And number two, fun can be a very subjective term. So who says I care about balancing short-term pleasure with long-term sustainability? And then also, number three, who says I should try to get my genes into the next generation? Because I'm sure evolution is somehow going to come up in the conversation. So let me just go ahead and throw that out there right now. Why should I be loyal to the accident of evolution that created me? So the distinction absolutely has to be made. On atheism, there is no objective meaning in the universe. Everything is a cosmic accident. Nobody's born on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's going to die. Life is a miracle of incalculable coincidences. Stephen Jay Gould is a physicist, and he has a noteworthy quote. Listen to this. Quote, "We are here because an odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. Because comets struck Earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance, not otherwise available. So, thank your lucky stars in a literal sense. Because the Earth never froze entirely during an ice age. Because a small and tenuous species, arising in Africa 250,000 years ago, has managed, so far, to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating." End quote. The Christian thinker Ravi Zacharias has a brilliant response. Listen to this. Quote, "There's a terrible irony in all of this, isn't there? What is this exhilaration and liberation he is talking about? Am I missing something? Is this liberation synonymous with the fact that we have become one of the most violent and drugged nations on earth? Is this the exhilaration that makes sedatives and antacids the most highly sold drugs across pharmaceutical counters to slow us down from our mad rush for ever-increasing wealth? Is this the exhilaration that is sending our songwriters and musicians into a frenzy on the stage and a stupor in their homes? Is this the exhilaration venting forth on our talk shows that pride themselves in profane argument as entertainment? Is this the exhilaration that has fragmented our families and often victimized the weakest in our midst? Is this the exhilaration of living in the bloodiest century in history? That would be the 20th century. Is this the exhilaration of a generation of young people, often fatherless, many times hopeless? Is this all reason for exhilaration?" End quote. I'm absolutely amazed at how we have built a culture that thrives on the idea that we must make life meaningful for ourselves because there is no objective meaning. And then we're completely surprised when this message of meaninglessness gets through to our children and they go downstairs and they think about it for weeks and months and years. And when they come back upstairs, they have discovered that life is pain and existence is evil, and they should do everything they can to destroy as many people as they can in order to protest the crime of being born. Why are we so blown away that people would act out the logical conclusion of the premises we broadcast day and night? Those premises being that there is no objective meaning to life, but you just have to make it up as you go along. And this is what makes the Christian idea of meaning so powerful. It's that it's not subjective. We're not saying that if you become a Christian, then you'll never be unfulfilled because you'll always be busy with Sunday morning service and church camp and youth group and mission trips. Look at us. We can give you the most stimulating subjective meaning out there. You'll be so busy reading your Bible that you won't have time to think about drugs. No. That's Pierre Bezukhov and the masonry. You'll be disillusioned with that by attending a single Sunday morning service in most churches. The hypocrisy and the greed and the pettiness will drive you right out, just like it did with Pierre. The true Christian idea of meaning is not about you. It's about God. It's about recognizing that everything has a purpose, a telos, a design, an aim, a goal to fulfill. Every tree, every star, each ocean, each human being is woven into existence and created with a specific function in mind. And God created all of it to display his beauty and splendor and wonder and glory. And once you see yourself as someone who is honored beyond comprehension to be able to witness the gift of spectating a universe where God exists, not to mention take part in it, then your quest for subjective meaning is over because you found the objective meaning of the universe. When I was a kid, I went through a phase where I wanted to be a construction worker. And I remember visiting my grandparents, and I wanted to practice nailing nails into a tree. And so I asked my grandfather if I could find a tree to nail holes into. And he said no. And I was surprised and a little hurt, frankly. And I was like, why not? And his answer is that it hurts the tree. And trees are not toys just to be destroyed because you want to nail nails in it randomly. And my grandfather was actually communicating something important. The universe doesn't exist to bend to your whim and will. That tree has a purpose that God has given it, and being a living board for nails isn't one of them. I built a birdhouse later, by the way, and we had a great time, so that was a positive experience. So you see the utility of a theistic worldview. In one view, says the Christian one, everything has a purpose. In one view, say the Christian one, the theistic one, everything has a purpose. Trees and children alike are meant to show us something deep and profound and lovely about God, and should therefore be taken care of, examined, and cherished. The opposite view is the logical conclusion of atheism. Nothing matters, everything is an accident, moral obligations are a lie told by the powerful to keep the status quo. Make it up for yourself as you go along. Life is a freak accident, which also happens to be the greatest tragedy conceivable, and try to have as much fun as you can before everything ends in the heat death of the universe. Jordan Peterson, the professor of psychology from the University of Toronto, has given a lot of time and attention to this idea of the meaning of life, so I think it's worth looking at what he has to say. Peterson has spent most of his public life infamously silent and dodgy about the question of whether God exists or whether he thinks Christianity is true, but nevertheless, the answers that Peterson gives have helped countless people feel fulfilled and improve the lives of many who were nihilistic and aimless and giving in to all kinds of self-destructive tendencies. Peterson's essential claim is that suffering presents its own meaning, that taking responsibility to alleviate suffering gives life a self-evident purpose. If you ask the question, well, what will it matter 1 billion years from now whether I kill myself or try to live a good life, then really you're just using the wrong framework. Peterson would say that obviously life is full of suffering, but you can discover within yourself the strength to bear this and carry it and become a better person so that you won't make it any worse. And maybe you can just alleviate some of the suffering in the world too if you grow strong and competent, which every human being is essentially capable of. Notice that many of these premises are basically Christian. In the end, however, Peterson refuses to use his public and academic name to point to a God who is actually there, objective, relevant, powerful, and present. And whether it's because he believes that everyone must have their own personal journey, or because he doesn't want to be thrown in with a lot of religious Christians, or maybe he doesn't actually believe you can rationally justify a belief in God, and he therefore doesn't want to defend it rationally, at the end of the day, Peterson's view ends up being reduced to sheer pragmatism. The result of the Christian ethic and worldview without God at the foundation of it ends up being, well, hey, maybe Jesus didn't rise from the dead and there isn't a man in the sky, but the Christian ideas are too psychologically powerful to ignore. So basically, we should just live like they're true, even if they're actually not. For some people, though, me included, this isn't good enough. I don't want to pretend like the Christian ideas, well, they work, and so I'm just going to act them out. I want to know, does God exist or not? If he exists, then he created the universe intentionally, and therefore human beings have a purpose. But if God doesn't exist, then the universe doesn't have a purpose. And frankly, I'd rather know. I'd rather know that. I don't want to just pretend like it has a purpose in order to muster my way through life. So here's the significant question. Can we find meaning in our lives? And why should I be a good person? Why should you care about the environment? Why shouldn't you just snort cocaine on the weekends? Why shouldn't I just end my life right here and now rather than endure the pain of living? Why not live in the constant pursuit of your next chemical-induced high? Or why not just pursue every sexual encounter you could ever find? The atheist must answer with silence. Nothing matters. Jordan Peterson won't get you much farther, really. After all, if the self-evident meaning of life is to alleviate suffering, well, sounds like it'd be a pretty good thing if we could all just find a way to die in our sleep. Peterson's view essentially boils down to atheist pragmatism. We have to act like Christianity is true, otherwise life is unlivable, and we'll just deny that we're doing this with complex intellectual arguments. If there's one thing I want you to understand from this podcast, it is this. The question of meaning is tied so closely with the question of whether or not God exists that they are inseparable. And it's actually very simple. Just think about it. If God created the universe, then he did so with a reason. Nobody designs something with no purpose. Every man-made object has an intended goal with which the object is trying to fulfill. Do you know what we call objects that don't have any purpose to fulfill? We call them junk, trash. We call them worthless. We dispose of them. They just take up space and waste time and energy. So the question has to be asked, are human beings designed with an intended goal? Or are we the accidental byproduct of a cruel world, and now we just have to scrounge for a menial existence before we inevitably return to the dust like the billions of human beings who have lived before us? If God created us, then we have a purpose. If there is no God, then we have no purpose. As a matter of fact, C.S. Lewis uses this line of reasoning as an argument for the existence of an objective meaning and therefore the existence of an objective God. Lewis argues that human beings only crave things that actually exist. We crave food because we need nutrition. We crave water because we need to stay hydrated. And it would be preposterous to think that if we crave something, well, maybe it doesn't exist at all. His conclusion, therefore, is that if mankind craves meaning to life, then it seems logical to say that meaning actually exists. And the answer is not to deny the fact that we feel like we need meaning, but to actually find meaning, an objective meaning. Still, I do want to say that the rise of Jordan Peterson, along with his continued popularity, should be a lesson to Christians and atheists alike about the significance of meaning in the modern age. See, the new atheists don't take the question of meaning seriously at all. If you're depressed, if you think your life is meaningless, there is something wrong with you. Go see a doctor. Take some pills. Sam Harris calls the question of meaning a software glitch in the brain. It's a nonsensical question. Peterson's criticism of the modern church also hits home. The church, along with the conservative political right in general, is so preoccupied with duty. We have a duty to obey God. We have a duty not to cheat on our spouses. We have a duty to our country. You shouldn't do drugs because, well, drugs are bad. We're basically like the masonry. And when people like Pierre come along looking to find meaning in life and they look at our churches, they find the masonry, just like Pierre. We haven't been told that if God exists, then he has created the universe with intentionality, and he has a mission for the universe, and that mission extends to our very lives, and we can discover what that is. So Christianity offers twofold meaning with one answer. If creation was designed to glorify God, and human beings are also purposed to glorify God and enjoy him forever, then Christianity gives objective purpose to the universe. Sunsets are meant to be enjoyed. Birds are meant to be pleasing to the ear in the morning. Mountains are meant to show us grandeur. Rain is meant to give life to the earth. Galaxies exist to show God's power. Trees are not for mindlessly nailing holes into. Rivers are not for industrial waste. History is moving somewhere. Everything happens for a reason. The prophet Isaiah says that God has named every star in the sky and placed it there intentionally. And secondly, human beings are meant to be a part of this. We're meant to be witnesses to God's beauty, his moral perfection, his holiness, his creativity. We're meant to share in this good universe that God has created out of his own nature. We're meant to reflect his love and his mercy and his goodness to one another. We're meant to share food and laugh and get married and have children. We're meant to build bridges in cities and microcomputers. We're meant to write books and poems and plant gardens and discover and categorize every species of frog and measure the depths of the ocean and send probes to space and take pictures of Saturn's rings. And when we do all of these things, we're meant to remember and give thanks and marvel at the God who created them all for us. You see, since the Enlightenment, there's been this idea that the meaning of life is just not an important question. It's just not one that normal people ask. This is where the new atheists are taking their cues. The truth is that people still lived their lives as if Christianity were true. They enjoyed the value system their culture had inherited from Christianity while rejecting the Bible and this other supernatural stuff that perhaps they got it from. The truth is that people still lived their lives as if Christianity were actually true. They enjoyed the value system that their culture had from Christianity while rejecting the Bible and the supernatural in general. Eventually, though, the cosmic loneliness began to set in with the death of God. As Nietzsche declared the death of God, he said that human beings will have to rise up and create our own values, our own meaning. We'll have to fulfill our own will to power. But it turns out that we cannot invent our own futures. If life is meaningless and nothing you do matters, it's pretty hard to live pretending otherwise. Modern psychology is racing to diagnose the human condition in a rationalistic way. Maybe we have chemical imbalances, or maybe we need to be striving against something to feel satisfied. But at the end of the day, if we're just overgrown monkeys, then no amount of spin is ever going to fulfill the worthlessness of life. I am convinced that the question of the meaning of life is not something that we always ask of life, but it is always something that life asks of us. Let me unpack that a little. You may never ask yourself, what is the meaning of life? It kind of sounds abstract and maybe a little ridiculous. Perhaps you should just say 42 is the meaning of life and move on. But life will ask you what its purpose is, over and over. You'll feel the question loom when you're going through a bitter divorce, or when you finally get that promotion, or when you get home early from work to an empty apartment, or when you're alone in a crowd at a party. The meaning of life is a question that's better expressed through literature than philosophy, because it's better expressed through emotions than ideas. We don't ask what the meaning of life is with language, but we can all relate to Pierre Bezukhov, who can't be alone and who has a terrifying midlife crisis. A depressed teenager might not ask what the meaning of life is, but if you're paying attention, his cryptic diary and his dark poetry will reveal what his true inquiry is. One thing that I think Peterson gets exactly right is the relationship between meaning and moral responsibility. I mean, why not do marijuana or cocaine? Why go to school or get a good job or be a good person? Why should I get married? Should I lie? The meaning of life comes up every second of every day in multifaceted ways. What am I doing? What am I here for? Am I striving for success or pleasure or happiness? Or am I just trying to survive? What are my goals? And how will my actions affect my goals? Am I just a moist robot that's been wound up and now I'm slowly winding down towards death? Or is there actually something more to life? Is there actually something tragic about a man who overdoses on heroin at 29 as opposed to the man who dies of a heart attack at his 93rd birthday? Or is the only difference just 64 years of life, which is a cosmic speck of dust on endlessly marching time? You see, I don't think so. Augustine once said that our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. I agree with him, and I agree with Tolstoy in the conclusion that he gives Pierre, and the conclusion that he found himself before writing the character in the first place. I think the Judeo-Christian tradition, rooted in the answers that Christ gave, got it right. I believe the purpose of existence is to put the greatness of God on display. That means every galaxy and star and life on this planet exists to show God's greatness, His beauty, His love, and His justice. So therefore, what fulfills man? What makes us ultimately satisfied with this life? If being a good pilot means operating an aircraft safely and effectively, what does it mean to be a good person? You see, I think the answer to the question, what does it mean to be a good person, to successfully operate as a human being in a healthy and effective way, I think the answer to that is to see God for who He is and to let the power and love and beauty of God transform you to be a little more loving, a little more beautiful. You know, Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And I do believe that if we spend our lives trying to fulfill these commandments in an attempt to reflect God's character, we will live satisfied and meaningful lives. At the end of War and Peace, Pierre is satisfied and at peace with life because he begins to view things this way. He's able to relax and look at history and his family and his friends as things that are not cosmic accidents, but intentional works of art created by God to be enjoyed. And so when his wife cheats on him and leaves, it's a little less painful because he knows that God is there and He's looking out for him and He allowed it to happen in order to grow him. And he needs to be paying attention to the lesson rather than griping and moaning and turning bitter and sour and angry. This outlook allows Pierre to take pleasure in the things that are good and to endure with dignity the pain when it comes. And this is ultimately what leaves Pierre fulfilled. And in the end, this is how Pierre finds his purpose.